The story of Rachel Mellon-Skemp begins quietly, without warning, in a place that should have been safe. A family home. A school morning that never became a school day. A winter afternoon that ended with a child vanishing without a trace. This is not a story of chaos or visible struggle. It is a story defined by silence, unanswered questions, and the unsettling absence of evidence. Rachel Marie Mellon-Skemp was 13 years old when she disappeared. She lived in Bolingbrook, Illinois, a suburban community southwest of Chicago, known for its residential neighborhoods, schools, and a sense of ordinary routine. Rachel was described by those who knew her as a typical teenager for her age. She attended school regularly, had friends, and was known to be responsible enough to follow household rules. There was nothing in the days leading up to her disappearance that suggested she was planning to run away or vanish from her life. On the morning of Wednesday, January 31st, 1996, Rachel did not go to school. She was reportedly feeling unwell and stayed home. This detail would later become one of the most important aspects of the case. Rachel was not supposed to be alone for long periods that day, but she was expected to remain inside the house while the adults around her went about their routines. At the time, Rachel lived with her mother and her stepfather, Vincent Mellon, who was often referred to as Vince. Her biological father was not living in the home. The family dynamic, as later described publicly, did not raise immediate red flags to investigators. There were no known reports of abuse, no recent domestic disturbances, and no official complaints that suggested the household was unstable. On the surface, it appeared to be an ordinary family situation. That morning passed without incident. According to statements later given to police, Rachel stayed in her bedroom for much of the day. She was believed to be resting. There were no phone calls reported from her that afternoon. No friends stated that she had made plans to meet anyone. No notes were found indicating that she intended to leave the house. As the day moved into the afternoon, the timeline becomes more fragile, built almost entirely on recollection rather than physical proof. Vincent Mellon stated that at some point during the afternoon, he left the house to walk the family dog. He said that Rachel was still inside the home when he left. When he returned, he claimed that he did not immediately check on her. Later, when it became clear that Rachel was no longer in the house, concern quickly turned into panic. Rachel was gone. Her disappearance was not dramatic. There were no broken doors or shattered windows. There were no signs of forced entry. The house looked the same as it had earlier that day. Her bedroom did not appear ransacked. Her personal belongings were largely untouched. Her shoes were still inside. Her coat was still in the house. Her bag and other everyday items had not been taken. The weather that day was cold. This detail would haunt investigators and family members alike. January in Illinois is not forgiving, especially for a child. The idea that Rachel would leave the house voluntarily without proper clothing seemed highly unlikely to those who knew her. Yet she was gone. As police began to examine her bedroom more closely, they noticed something strange. While most of Rachel's belongings remained, a blue blanket and 2 pillows from her bed were missing. These items were not found anywhere inside the home. There was no clear explanation for why those specific objects would be gone while everything else stayed behind. The absence of those items raised immediate questions. Why would a child take bedding but leave behind shoes, a coat, and money? Why would someone leave the house carrying bulky items instead of essentials? And how could this happen without anyone noticing? The family reported Rachel missing later that day. Law enforcement responded quickly. Initial searches focused on the neighborhood, nearby streets, and common areas where a child might wander. Friends were contacted. Classmates were questioned. Teachers were asked whether Rachel had spoken about leaving or seemed distressed in the days prior. Nothing concrete emerged. As hours turned into days, the investigation intensified. Detectives began looking inward, examining the home and the people who were last known to have seen Rachel. This is standard procedure in missing child cases, but it also marked the beginning of long-standing suspicion and controversy. Vincent Mellon became a central figure in the investigation. He was the last known adult to be with Rachel before she vanished. He cooperated with authorities, providing statements and submitting to questioning. Over time, he would also submit DNA samples and take polygraph examinations. Despite public suspicion and intense scrutiny, no charges were filed against him. The lack of physical evidence made the case exceptionally difficult. There were no confirmed sightings of Rachel after that day, no credible tips that led to her location, no remains discovered, no belongings found discarded along roads or in wooded areas. It was as if she had disappeared into nothing. As the investigation continued, law enforcement explored multiple theories. One possibility was that Rachel left the house on her own. This theory struggled under scrutiny. Rachel had no known history of running away. She left behind essential items. The weather made voluntary departure dangerous. There was no evidence that she had arranged to meet anyone. Another possibility was that someone entered the home and took her. Again, there was no sign of forced entry. No neighbors reported seeing anything unusual. No vehicles were identified that could be connected to such a scenario. A third possibility, one that remained unspoken publicly for long periods but loomed over the case, was that something happened inside the home itself. Investigators did not have enough evidence to support this theory in a way that would lead to charges. Without physical proof, the case remained suspended in uncertainty. Years passed. Rachel's case did not fade completely from public memory, but it did not receive the sustained national attention that some other missing child cases did. Her family and friends continued to seek answers. Memorials were held. Her name remained in law enforcement databases. Age-progressed images were created to show what Rachel might look like as she grew older. Decades later, the case remains officially open. Rachel Mellon-Skemp has never been found. Her disappearance continues to trouble investigators and true crime researchers because it defies many of the patterns typically seen in missing child cases. There is no clear beginning, no confirmed middle, and no ending. Only a moment in time where a young girl was present, and then suddenly she was not. Cases like this leave behind more than unanswered questions. They leave behind a quiet, enduring unease, the kind that lingers not because of what is known, but because of what may never be known. If you're watching this on Dark Psyche Case Files, take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, and hit the subscribe button. It helps keep these cases visible, and it helps ensure that names like Rachel Mellon-Skemp are not forgotten. This is only the beginning of her story. Alright, here is Chapter 2. Same rules followed. Non-fictional documentary tone, ads friendly, all dates and numbers written in words, no subheadings. I will stop at the end and ask before continuing. As the initial shock of Rachel Mellon-Skemp's disappearance settled into something heavier and more permanent, law enforcement shifted from immediate response to long-term investigation. The early hours had been about urgency, canvassing streets, calling out her name, hopping for a frightened child hiding nearby. When those efforts produced nothing, the reality became unavoidable. Rachel had not simply wandered off. Something had gone terribly wrong. Police returned to the Mellon-Skemp home repeatedly. Each visit was methodical. Each question was deliberate. Investigators understood that when a child disappears from inside a home with no sign of forced entry, the answers are usually close, not distant. The house itself became a focal point, not as a crime scene in the traditional sense, but as a puzzle missing its centerpiece. Rachel's bedroom was examined in detail. Her bed was still made, aside from the missing blue blanket and 2 pillows. There was no visible disturbance that suggested a struggle. Drawers were not overturned. Shelves were undisturbed. Her personal items remained exactly where they were expected to be. There were no notes, No journal entries indicating fear or plans to leave. Nothing that explained why she would vanish on a cold winter afternoon. Investigators paid close attention to the timeline provided by Vincent Mellon. According to his account, Rachel had been home alone while he went about his day. He stated that when he left to walk the family dog, Rachel was still inside the house. He said the dog had briefly escaped, which delayed his return. When he eventually came back, he did not immediately check on Rachel. It was only later, when the house felt unusually quiet, that the realization set in. This window of time became one of the most scrutinized elements of the case. Exactly how long was Rachel alone? Exactly when was she last seen? Could someone have entered the home during that period without being noticed? Could Rachel have left on her own during those minutes? Despite repeated questioning, no inconsistencies strong enough to support charges were publicly identified. Vincent Mellon cooperated with authorities. He provided DNA samples. He submitted to polygraph examinations. While polygraph results are not admissible in court and are not always reliable, they are often used as investigative tools. Even so, nothing emerged that allowed police to move forward legally. Public suspicion, however, is not bound by the same standards as criminal law. As news of the case spread locally, attention turned inward. Neighbors discussed what they had or had not seen that day. Some recalled seeing nothing unusual at all. No screams, no suspicious vehicles, no strangers knocking on doors. Others later questioned whether they might have missed something small, something that did not seem important at the time. Investigators expanded their search radius. Nearby parks, wooded areas, drainage systems, and abandoned spaces were searched. Dogs were brought in. Volunteers joined the effort. Flyers bearing Rachel's face were posted across the community. Her name was announced on local news stations. Each lead, no matter how small, was followed. Most led nowhere. Friends were interviewed carefully. Rachel's social circle was examined for clues. Did she have a secret friendship, an older acquaintance, someone she trusted enough to meet quietly? The answer, again and again, appeared to be no. Teachers described her as an average student. Friends described her as normal, sometimes quiet, sometimes playful. No one reported conversations about running away or escaping her home life. As days turned into weeks, the investigation faced a familiar and devastating shift. Tips slowed. Searches grew less frequent. The urgency that drives immediate action gave way to the slower, colder work of maintaining an open case without new evidence. Rachel's mother struggled publicly and privately. Losing a child without explanation creates a specific kind of pain, one that never settles into grief because there is no confirmation of loss. There was no body, no proof of death, no certainty of life, only absence. Law enforcement made it clear that the case was still active, but active does not always mean progressing. Without physical evidence, prosecutors had nothing to work with. Without witnesses, detectives could not establish a clear narrative. Every theory collapsed under the weight of unanswered questions. One theory suggested Rachel may have been taken by someone she knew, someone she trusted enough not to resist. Another suggested an accident, followed by a cover-up. A third considered the possibility of an opportunistic crime, a stranger acting within a narrow window of time. Each theory had gaps too wide to ignore. The missing blanket and pillows continued to stand out. Investigators could not explain why those items were gone. They were too large to carry unnoticed without purpose. Their absence suggested intent, but intent toward what remained unclear. No similar items were found discarded nearby. No landfill searches produced results. No construction sites yielded evidence. As months passed, Rachel's case became one of many open missing person files, but it never fully disappeared from public consciousness. Anniversaries of her disappearance brought renewed attention. News segments revisited the mystery. Friends spoke about who Rachel might have become. Age progression images were created, showing her as an older teenager, then as a young adult. Each image was a reminder that time was moving forward, even if the case was not. Police maintained that they had not ruled anything out. They continued to encourage anyone with information to come forward, no matter how insignificant it might seem. In cases like this, investigators know that sometimes the smallest detail, recalled years later, can shift everything. But years went by without that moment. Rachel Mellon-Skemp remained missing. Her case settled into a painful limbo, one where questions outnumbered answers and suspicion lingered without resolution. It became the kind of mystery that reshapes how a community thinks about safety, about familiarity, about what can happen behind closed doors on an ordinary day. And still, no one could say with certainty what happened to Rachel after she was last seen inside her home. If you're following this case on Dark Psyche Case Files, remember to like the video, leave a comment, and hit the subscribe button. Every interaction helps keep cold cases alive and reminds the world that these stories are not finished. As time moved further away from the winter day Rachel Mellon-Skemp vanished, the case entered a phase that many missing person investigations never escape. The evidence did not grow. The questions did not shrink. What changed instead was perception. What had once been viewed as a sudden disappearance slowly transformed into a long-term mystery, and with that shift came speculation, doubt, and a deeper psychological weight on everyone involved. Investigators continued to review the same limited set of facts, again and again, hoping that something overlooked would finally stand out. The timeline was reconstructed repeatedly. The house was mentally rewalked. Statements were reread. Each detail was examined not just for what it said, but for what it did not. One of the most troubling aspects of Rachel's disappearance was the absence of noise. There were no reports of screams. No neighbors recalled hearing an argument or a struggle. In a residential neighborhood during daylight hours, this silence felt unnatural. If Rachel had been taken by force, it would have required speed, control, and an extraordinary amount of luck to avoid detection. This reality forced investigators to consider uncomfortable possibilities. The idea that Rachel may have willingly gone with someone was explored more deeply. This did not mean she wanted to disappear, but that she may have trusted the person she left with. In many cases involving children, trust becomes a vulnerability. However, interviews with family, friends, and school staff continued to point in the same direction. There was no known individual in Rachel's life who fit this scenario convincingly. No secret relationship emerged. No hidden communication was discovered. At the time, personal technology was limited compared to modern standards. There were no social media accounts to analyze, no personal mobile device to retrieve messages from. What investigators had was memory, and memory fades. As suspicion lingered around the household, law enforcement maintained a careful balance. They could not ignore the fact that Rachel disappeared from inside her own home, yet they also could not act without proof. Vincent Mellon remained under scrutiny for years. He was questioned multiple times and continued to assert that he did not know what happened to Rachel. Public opinion, however, was divided. Some believed his account, others did not. This divide created a secondary impact of the case, one that rarely receives attention. When a disappearance remains unresolved, it fractures not just families but communities. Neighbors begin to question one another. Familiar routines feel less safe. Trust erodes quietly. Rachel's mother lived with constant uncertainty. Without confirmation of death, there was no closure. Without evidence of life, there was no relief. Each passing year carried the same question: is she still out there? And if so, does she remember who she was? Law enforcement agencies periodically revisited the case. Advances in forensic science brought renewed hope. DNA analysis became more precise. Databases expanded. Missing person records became interconnected across jurisdictions. Rachel's information was entered and re-entered, cross-checked against unidentified remains and missing individuals nationwide. No matches were found. Age-progressed images became a central tool. These images attempted to show what Rachel might look like as time passed, factoring in family traits and natural aging. Each image was both hopeful and heartbreaking. Hopeful because it suggested she might still be alive. Heartbreaking because it emphasized how much time had been lost. Tips continued to come in sporadically. Some were sincere but mistaken. Others were vague. A few were clearly unreliable. Each tip was logged, assessed, and ultimately ruled out. None led to Rachel. As years turned into decades, the case took on a symbolic quality. It became a reminder of how easily someone can vanish without explanation. It challenged the assumption that danger always announces itself loudly. Rachel did not disappear in the middle of the night or from a distant location. She disappeared during the day from her own home, while sick, in familiar surroundings. That reality disturbed investigators even more than the lack of evidence. Cold cases are often described as dormant, but they are rarely forgotten by those closest to them. Rachel's disappearance continued to exist in the background of law enforcement records, waiting for the one detail that could change everything. A confession, a recovered item, a witness finally ready to speak. None came. The psychological toll of not knowing cannot be overstated. In resolved cases, even tragic ones, there is an end point. In Rachel's case, there was only continuation. Each year added distance without direction. Each anniversary reinforced the same unanswered questions. Where did she go? Why did she leave behind everything she needed? What happened during that narrow window of time? And why has no trace of her ever been found? For viewers of dark Psyche case files, these are the moments where true crime becomes something more than a story. It becomes an examination of absence, of uncertainty, and of how fragile certainty really is. If you're watching, remember to like this video, leave a comment, and hit the subscribe button. Your support helps ensure that cases like Rachel's remain visible, even when answers are hard to find. By the time Rachel Mellon-Skemp's disappearance reached its 10th year, the case had crossed an invisible threshold. It was no longer just an active investigation. It had become a psychological burden carried by everyone who had ever touched it. Detectives, family members, journalists, and eventually true crime researchers all found themselves circling the same unanswered questions. Hopping repetition might reveal what time had hidden. Cold cases do not simply go quiet. They echo. Each review brings back the same moments, the same statements, the same haunting absence of proof. Rachel's case was revisited repeatedly by law enforcement as technology advanced. Every few years it was pulled from storage, laid out again, and examined with fresh eyes. Yet the facts never changed. Rachel was 13 years old. She stayed home from school because she was sick. She was last known to be inside her home. She vanished without shoes, without a coat, without money, without identification. The weather was winter cold. There were no witnesses, no confirmed sightings, no physical trace. One of the most disturbing aspects of the case was how completely Rachel seemed to disappear from the world. In many missing person cases, something eventually surfaces. A piece of clothing, a witness who remembers something years later, a body discovered in a location previously overlooked. Rachel left nothing behind except questions. As the investigation aged, detectives began focusing more intensely on probability rather than possibility. While many theories were technically possible, not all were equally likely. Voluntary disappearance continued to be viewed as improbable. Rachel had no history of running away. She left behind necessities. She was ill. She had future plans. Nothing in her behavior suggested she intended to leave her life behind. The theory of an opportunistic stranger also struggled under scrutiny. For this to be true, someone would have needed to know Rachel was alone, gain access to the house without force, remove her quietly, and leave no trace. In daylight, in a residential neighborhood, without being seen. That left one remaining category of explanation, the one investigators are always cautious to discuss publicly: an incident within the home itself. Law enforcement never officially named a suspect. Vincent Mellon was never charged. Still, his role as the last adult known to be with Rachel ensured that suspicion followed him for years. He maintained his innocence consistently. From a legal standpoint, the lack of evidence meant the case could go no further. From a public standpoint, doubt lingered. This divide between legal certainty and public suspicion is where many cold cases stall permanently. Rachel's mother continued to speak about her daughter over the years, describing the pain of living in uncertainty. She spoke of birthdays that passed without answers, holidays marked by absence, and the constant internal conflict of hope versus reality. To believe Rachel was alive meant believing she had survived unimaginable circumstances. To believe she was gone meant accepting a loss without proof. Law enforcement agencies often say that time is both an enemy and an ally. Witness memories fade, but secrets sometimes surface. Guilt can erode silence. Rachel's case depended heavily on the hope that someone somewhere knew more than they had ever said. Advances in forensic databases offered new possibilities. Unidentified remains from across the country were compared against missing person records. Rachel's DNA profile was preserved for future comparison. Age-progressed images were updated, showing her as a young adult, then as a woman approaching middle age. Each update carried an unspoken message: Rachel could be anywhere or nowhere. Media coverage resurfaced periodically. Local news stations revisited the case on major anniversaries. Journalists described it as one of the most baffling disappearances in Illinois history. The story was retold carefully, avoiding accusations while acknowledging the unsettling facts. True crime audiences began to engage with the case more actively as the genre grew. Online discussions dissected timelines, questioned statements, and debated theories. While these conversations kept Rachel's name alive, they also highlighted the ethical tension of discussing an unresolved case involving real people. Through it all, law enforcement maintained that the case remained open. This distinction mattered. An open case means there is still belief that answers could come. It means the file is not sealed, not forgotten, not dismissed as unsolvable. Yet years continued to pass. The house where Rachel disappeared eventually became just another home. New memories replaced old ones. Life moved forward for everyone except Rachel. This contrast is one of the quiet tragedies of missing person cases. The world adapts, the absence remains. Rachel Mellon-Skemp's disappearance forced investigators to confront one of the most uncomfortable truths in criminal investigation. Sometimes, despite effort, technology, and persistence, the truth does not reveal itself, not because it is impossible to uncover, but because it was successfully concealed. And if that is the case, the concealment began on an ordinary winter afternoon, inside a quiet house, while the rest of the world carried on unaware. As the years stretched on, Rachel Mellon-Skemp's disappearance became defined less by new information and more by the absence of it. Investigators often say that when a case reaches this stage, the truth usually exists in one of two places. Either it is locked inside a person who has never spoken, or it lies buried beneath a moment that was successfully erased before anyone realized it mattered. Rachel's case showed signs of both. Law enforcement quietly revisited every version of the timeline. The window between when Rachel was last confirmed inside the home and when her absence was noticed remained critically important. That span of time was narrow enough to suggest that whatever happened occurred quickly, deliberately, and without hesitation. There was no evidence of panic, no frantic movement, no desperate attempt to flee. Everything pointed to control. This understanding influenced how detectives viewed the missing blanket and pillows. These items were not necessities. They were not practical for travel. Their absence suggested they were used for a purpose, not comfort. Investigators never publicly stated what they believed that purpose might have been, but internally, the question remained unresolved and deeply troubling. Search efforts expanded beyond the immediate area over time. Bodies of water were examined. Construction zones that existed during the period were reviewed. Changes in the surrounding environment were considered. Development alters landscapes, and investigators know that what exists today may not reflect what was there decades ago. Still, nothing surfaced. Rachel's DNA profile was retained and entered into national databases designed to match unidentified remains with missing individuals. Each time unidentified remains were discovered anywhere in the country, comparisons were made. Each time, the result was the same: no match. This lack of connection suggested one of two possibilities. Either Rachel's remains had never been recovered, or she had not died in a way that left recoverable evidence. Neither conclusion offered comfort. As the case aged, law enforcement emphasized one critical point whenever it was discussed publicly. Rachel's disappearance was not being treated as a runaway situation. This distinction mattered. It shaped how resources were allocated and how the public was asked to engage with the case. Investigators wanted people to understand that Rachel did not choose to vanish. Community members continued to struggle with the idea that something so severe could happen without anyone noticing. The neighborhood had not been isolated. It had not been deserted. Life had gone on around the house that day as usual. Cars passed. People walked by. No one reported seeing a child carrying bedding or leaving in distress. This reality reinforced a theory that whatever happened may not have occurred outside the home at all. Yet without physical proof, the case could not cross the line from suspicion to certainty. Law enforcement operates within boundaries that public opinion does not. While many believe they knew what happened, belief is not evidence. Evidence is what courts require, and evidence never materialized. Rachel's mother lived with this divide every day. The public discussion of the case often drifted into speculation, but for her, the disappearance was not theoretical. It was personal. Each rumor, each theory, each anniversary reopened the same wound. Hope and grief existed side by side, neither able to fully take over. Over time, investigators began to acknowledge that the case might only be resolved through information that had not yet come forward. Someone speaking, someone remembering, someone finally choosing to tell the truth after years of silence. Cold cases are sometimes solved decades later for this exact reason. The passage of time can change loyalties. Relationships shift. Guilt grows heavier. People age, and with age sometimes comes a desire to unburden oneself. Rachel's case depended on that possibility. Media coverage in later years took on a reflective tone. Journalists described the disappearance as haunting and deeply unsettling. It was often framed as a reminder that danger does not always come from outside, and that not all crimes leave visible scars. True crime audiences found the case difficult to categorize. There was no dramatic chase, no confirmed suspect, no arrest, only a child who vanished and a silence that followed her. And yet, the case refused to disappear completely. Law enforcement continued to state publicly that Rachel Mellon-Skemp's disappearance remained open and active. Her name remained in missing person registries. Her image continued to be shared. Each effort was a declaration that time alone would not erase her. Rachel would be nearly middle-aged today. That thought alone carries enormous weight. A life paused at 13, frozen in time, while the world moved forward. Every year that passes without answers makes the original day of her disappearance feel both distant and painfully present. Cases like Rachel's challenge the idea that every mystery has a solution waiting to be uncovered. Some truths are fragile. Some are buried intentionally. Some are lost to moments no one realized needed to be remembered. But as long as the case remains open, there is still a chance. If you're watching this on Dark Psyche Case Files, remember to like this video, leave a comment, and hit the subscribe button. Your engagement keeps cases like Rachel Mellon-Skemp's in the public eye, where answers are more likely to emerge. By the time Rachel Mellon-Skemp's disappearance reached its third decade, the case existed in a strange space between memory and mystery. It was no longer a fresh wound in the public eye, yet it was far from forgotten. For those who had followed the story from the beginning, Rachel remained frozen at 13 years old, while the world around her continued to change. Law enforcement often describes long-term missing person cases as unfinished conversations. The facts are known. The questions are clear. What is missing is the response that makes everything align. Rachel's case was exactly that, a conversation waiting for an answer that never came. Over the years, detectives revisited the psychological profile of the situation. When a child disappears from inside their own home without preparation, investigators look less at opportunity and more at circumstance. Rachel had been sick. She had stayed home from school. She was vulnerable, isolated, and dependent on the adults responsible for her care that day. This reality shaped how the case was viewed internally. Even without evidence, investigators could not ignore probability. Children rarely vanish under those conditions unless something interrupts their routine, something sudden, something decisive. Yet probability alone cannot solve a case. As the years passed, advances in technology brought renewed but cautious optimism. DNA databases grew larger. Facial reconstruction software improved. Missing person networks became more interconnected across state and national boundaries. Rachel's information was updated repeatedly, her profile refined with each advancement. Still, no matches were made. One of the most painful aspects of unresolved cases is the way they resist finality. There is no official conclusion, no declaration of death, no legal closure. Families exist in a state of suspension, unable to grieve fully and unable to move on completely. Rachel's mother lived in that space for years, holding on to the possibility that her daughter might still be alive somewhere, even as time made that hope harder to carry. The public, meanwhile, often moved on more easily. New cases replaced old ones. Attention shifted. But for investigators and true crime researchers, Rachel's disappearance remained deeply unsettling because it challenged assumptions. It showed how little noise an irreversible event can make, how quietly a life can be interrupted. When people asked what made Rachel's case different, the answer was often the same. There was no moment anyone could point to and say, that is where everything changed. No confirmed crime scene, no verified last sighting beyond the walls of her home, just a before and an after, separated by a short stretch of time and a closed front door. Law enforcement continued to emphasize that the case remained open. This was not a formality. It was a commitment, an acknowledgement that somewhere, someone might still hold the key to understanding what happened on that winter afternoon. In many cold cases, resolution comes unexpectedly. A deathbed confession, a casual remark overheard years later, a piece of evidence discovered by accident. Rachel's case waited for that moment, suspended in uncertainty. As true crime media grew, her story found new audiences. Each retelling carried responsibility. Rachel was not a character. She was a real child, a daughter, a student, a person whose future was taken without explanation. Responsible coverage focused not on speculation but on facts, restraint, and remembrance. The most difficult truth about Rachel Mellon-Skemp's disappearance is not that it remains unsolved. It is that it may have been solvable once, and that moment passed unnoticed. If someone knew what happened and stayed silent, time has protected that silence. But time does not erase responsibility. Every year that passes without answers is a reminder that justice does not always arrive quickly, and sometimes it does not arrive at all. Yet cases like Rachel's persist because they matter. Because unresolved disappearances are not just about the past. They are about accountability, vigilance, and the value placed on every human life. Rachel would be an adult today. She would have lived decades beyond the moment she vanished. That reality alone demands that her story continue to be told. In unresolved cases like the disappearance of Rachel Mellon-Skemp, the passage of time does not soften the questions. It sharpens them. Each year that moves forward without answers makes the original moment feel more fragile, more distant, and yet more urgent. What happened on that winter afternoon did not simply vanish with Rachel. It left a permanent mark on everyone connected to her life. Law enforcement acknowledges that some cases survive not because they are actively moving forward, but because they refuse to be closed. Rachel's disappearance belongs in that category. It remains officially open, not as a formality, but as an admission that the truth has not yet surfaced. Somewhere, in memory or in silence, the missing piece still exists. When investigators revisit the case, they are confronted with the same unyielding facts. A 13-year-old girl stayed home from school because she was sick. She was last known to be inside her home. She disappeared during daylight hours. She left behind essential belongings. The weather was cold. No witnesses came forward. No physical evidence led to her location. No remains were ever found. These facts do not change, no matter how many times they are reviewed. What changes instead is perspective. As years pass, the people involved age, relationships shift, circumstances evolve. Someone who may have been afraid to speak in the past may feel differently later in life. Someone who dismissed a detail as unimportant may suddenly recognize its significance. This is why cold cases are never truly cold. They are waiting. Rachel's case depends entirely on that waiting. The absence of resolution has created a lasting psychological echo. For her family, it means living without certainty. For investigators, it means accepting limits while remaining open to possibility. For the public, it means confronting the uncomfortable truth that not every story ends with answers. True crime often focuses on resolution, arrests, confessions, verdicts. Rachel Mellon-Skemp's story challenges that structure. It exists without a conclusion, reminding us that disappearance is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is quiet, ordinary, and devastating in its simplicity. Rachel did not vanish while traveling. She did not disappear in a remote location. She was not taken from a crowd. She was last seen in a place where she should have been safest. That reality continues to unsettle those who study the case. If Rachel is no longer alive, then someone knows what happened to her. If she is alive, then her survival would represent an extraordinary endurance under unknown circumstances. Both possibilities carry weight. Both demand accountability. What remains undeniable is that Rachel mattered. Her life did not end simply because the answers stopped coming. She was a child with a future that was never allowed to unfold. Remembering her is not about speculation or blame. It is about recognition. Law enforcement continues to ask that anyone with information come forward, no matter how small or how much time has passed. In cases like this, even the most ordinary detail can become extraordinary when placed in the right context. A memory, a comment, a moment once ignored. Until that happens, Rachel Mellon-Skemp's disappearance remains what it has always been, an unanswered question suspended in time. And as long as that question exists, her story deserves to be told. If you're watching this on Dark Psyche Case Files, please like this video, leave a comment, and hit the subscribe button. Your support helps keep cases like Rachel Mellon-Skemp's visible, and visibility keeps the possibility of truth alive. This case is not closed, and Rachel is not forgotten.